In this video, we'll be looking at complex model binding, including the ability to pass multiple parameters into a controller action, and then the use of a model view or class for actually capturing multiple input parameters for an action and allowing the MVC framework to do that binding all for you pretty much automatically. This will be the last step before we actually look at doing multi-form submissions and doing basic input applications and projects. So in our last video, we actually started out with a single action that took a single parameter called name. We did some basic validation, and then we would take that name parameter, cast it to an object, and basically ship it over to the view, and then the view would pick it up as its single model, and then that model value would then be passed in and processed and presented as part of our view template. Now, what would happen if we wanted to present more than just name? So let's take a more basic or simplistic example, and let's say that we had two parameters called first name and last name. Now, with these two parameters, we will not need to do this validation as we've done it here. We'll do something similar to that. We'll do an if statement and say if string is null or empty for first name, then first name will equal Kevin, and if the string for last name and then we'll say last name equals Gantos. And then for our return, we'll just concatenate these together. And the end result on the view side will be the same. We'll have one model. That model will basically consist of just a string, and that string will be a concatenation of first and last name. So we'll go ahead and build and run that, and we end up with hello, Kevin Gantos. So we've basically taken the parameters from our controller, first name and last name, validate, we concatenate them together, return that as an object, and then that object string is picked up and then injected here in our model call. And that model call gives us the result of Kevin Gantos. Now, this works great for strings and basic types, but when we start to get into more complex types or the ability to actually ship or send those complex types to our view, we want to be able to do things in a more object-oriented fashion. So to do that, we actually have to do what's called creating a view model. Now, view models are just classes. There's nothing too overly elaborate or unique about them, but they're providing us with the structure that we need to be able to do this model binding. And it also gives us flexibility to grow and expand our model over time as, say, maybe a new field is added to a form or some other sort of change takes place in our application. So we'll go back to our home controller, and instead we're going to drop these parameters out. We'll drop out those parameters, and we'll basically return this back to kind of that more simplistic form. Then I'm going to go over to Models, right-click, Add, and I'm going to add a class. And I'm going to call this my user view model. Now, the term view model is not required inside of your view model classes. It's really more of a convention just for naming things to make them easy to identify. And inside of this view model, I'm going to add four properties. I'm going to add string first name, string of last name, a string of email address, and a string of password. Now, if you're wondering what I'm doing here, I'm using these code snippets by typing in prop, hitting double tab, and then that brings up kind of a template. The int is highlighted, the type, and I'm typing over that as string, and then I hit tab twice, and that brings me over to my property, and I'm going to then give it a name of email. So this is a shorthand way of getting our properties set up. We now have a view model, user view model. We have four properties here, first name, last name, email, and password. If we flip back over to our controller, before we had things like string first name and so forth, well, now instead we're just going to say user view model we'll include that namespace, and I'll just say model. And what will happen is that when parameters are passed in as query string parameters using a get or as a post value when we do a form submission, what will happen is that that first name field, that last name field, email, and password will actually be bound and loaded into this view model. And I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing here for this model and pass that model right into our view. I'm also going to add a breakpoint, so I want you to see what happens during the binding process. We'll leave this chunk of code alone for a moment, and we're just going to go ahead and run and see what's happening with our debugger. So our page is loaded, but it's debugging in the background. So we'll look at our model, and it says that we have a user view model being passed in, but if you think about it, we didn't actually pass anything in. If we look at our URL is empty, so there's no parameters being passed in. But what MVC does is it creates an instance of this user view model class, and then it just leaves all those values defaulted as null. And that's okay for now. We'll go ahead and pass this model in, and we'll see what our result is on the page. The result is that it says hello, and then the MVC engine goes ahead and using the razor syntax takes this .model. It identifies model as an object and not a string, and it goes for its default kind of action is to call the toString method. So calling toString just gives you the namespace and the class name, and that's the default for all the .NET framework. If you did the same thing with like a console.writeLine with an object, that object's name and namespace would just be written out to the console. So it defaults to just dumping out the class itself. So that looks nice, that's great, wonderful, but we're not actually saying like, hello Kevin Gantos, we're not saying anything like that. So first thing I'm going to do is do an explicit route, and then I'll go back and do question mark, and then now we have first name and last name of Kevin Gantos, no quotes. We'll hit enter. And we still have our breakpoint here, so we'll jump back here and we'll look at our model. So we have a user view model, and we'll see that our email is null, but first name has Kevin, last name now has Gantos, and password is still null. So we'll go ahead and take that model and pass it to our view, and our result is still Week3 project models user view model, because the MVC framework does not know how to bind and present specific properties from our view model. It simply is just saying view model.toString. Now if we want to actually put our name here on this line, we'll jump back into our view, and instead of doing the razor syntax with the @this.model, we're going to go ahead and change this up and make it more explicit. Now, just as you do in your model classes or any class that you create, this is kind of a self-referencing keyword. It's actually optional, so we can just say @model dot, and because this is still considered a dynamic type, we'll just type in first name, because we know there's a first name, space, and then add again model.last name. Now the space is interpreted by the razor engine that is the end of our C# statement. There's no need for semicolons. We simply just break the line or break the command, and at that point it then jumps back into HTML mode. That's why we add a second @ symbol, model.last name, and then it picks back up, and then we'll do the binding again using our model property. So we'll go ahead and save all of that, and we will jump back to our browser, and we'll do a refresh, and we'll still see that our model is first Kevin Gantos for first name, last name, and we'll hit continue, and now we have hello, comma, Kevin Gantos. So what's happening is that our view is actually pulling the first name property and the last name property and placing them directly on the web page. So if we come back here and we can do Steve Jobs, we can actually go ahead and remove that breakpoint, but we'll see here that our model has first name Steve, last name Jobs, hit continue, and then it outputs Steve Jobs to the page. We can do Bill Gates, and we get Bill Gates. So we've got that basic binding process happening here on the page. We can also add email and that parameter is being passed, but it's not being processed onto our view. So if we jump back to our controller, we'll add that breakpoint back. We'll reload this page. And then if we look at our model, we'll see that we now have an email property that is being populated with bill@microsoft.com. But on our view, we have nothing, so there's nothing being shown. So if we want to add that email address, we can come down here and say h2 model.email. And then if we come back, and you'll notice here that I haven't done a rebuild. I just simply added some HTML and added this little bit of razor, and I'm just saving it, and I'm coming back to the browser. Generally speaking, any changes that are made to your views that don't involve controller changes do not actually require a rebuild. You simply go in, you make the change to your view, and then you come back and you refresh your browser, and then those changes get picked up. So it's a much more casual and expected way to interface with web design from this perspective. So as you work on those views, and whether you're doing CSS changes or actual tag changes, those changes can be made and then a refresh can be applied, and in 99% of cases there's no need to do a rebuild. If you make any sort of model changes where you're actually modifying the model or you're modifying the controller, those do require a rebuild. And then that allows that code to actually be recompiled, and then the bindings will occur at the view level once those models and everything are kind of brought up to speed. The final thing that I want to show you is how to go about changing your view from treating your model as a dynamic and by changing it into what's called a strongly typed view. To do that is actually very simple. We'll start by stopping the debugger, and we'll come up to this very first line of our page, and this is our view page. So I'm going to do an @model space, and then what I want to do is I want to make this view strongly typed against the user view model. Now if you back out the IntelliSense by hitting escape, you'll see that we get a red squiggle on user view model. This reference needs to be absolute, and as long as you type your class in correctly, the easiest way to do that is to use your accelerator here that pops up and say that yes, this is the user view model I'm referring to, and it'll bring in the namespace for you. So it'll do week3 project.models.user view model. And this one line of code changes this model reference from being dynamic to actually being a static reference. So by coming up here and doing a rebuild solution, that model then becomes known to Visual Studio specifically, so that it's able to provide you with IntelliSense. Upon doing this, occasionally you actually have to back out of the view, and then we'll jump back into the view and allow Visual Studio to kind of catch up with what's going on here. But we'll see now that model is strongly bound. If we come after the dot and hit Control Spacebar, we now have IntelliSense. So there's email, first name, last name, and password. And the nice thing about doing this is that if you make a change to your model and you rebuild, your view will actually now throw build errors, and it'll throw compile time errors telling you that either a property is missing or maybe there was a type change. It just gives you more design time and compile time errors than you would have to deal with with that dynamic type, where you have to wait and then identify, is there something that needs to be changed, is there something that needs to be identified at runtime. So this is a much stronger way and a much more comprehensive way of building out your code. Now, final piece that I want to just bring in here is then we'll say @model.password, and that will be the password, and we'll go ahead and add like a short label here. We'll say this is the password, and a label for email, and that's really just kind of for aesthetics. So we've now added that fourth property. We flip back to our page here, and we will add, we'll add a fourth parameter of password, and we'll do password and hit enter. Oh, I stopped debugging, so let me go back. And you may end up with that where you stop debugging, you flip back to your browser, and your browser will fail to load. And that's really just due to the fact that you've stopped debugging, therefore IIS Express has also stopped. So you just go back, you start the build again, and that will bring you back to your page, and we'll add all of our parameters in, hit enter, and then there is our first name, last name, email address, and password, all bound to our view model, strongly typed views, allowing us that ability to take data and pass it into our views through our controllers and presenting it onto a page.